I used to work at my dad's restaurant when I was in my later teen years. It was just a regular local place, but was open until 2 a.m. every night. During high school, I would only work after school until 8, but once I graduated, I started working the closing shifts to save up money for college. The restaurant would be surprisingly busy at night, all the way up until closing. Mostly it was just people picking up online orders, but sometimes groups of friends would come in and hang out at one of the tables while they ate. I definitely preferred working at night though, as I would be the only one there and didn't have to listen to my dad bossing me around. Anyways, after 6 months of working nights, things started to get pretty weird. It was almost closing, around 1:45 a.m., and I was in the back cleaning when I heard the door ring. I finished up what I was doing and made my way to the front counter. There were 2 young men who looked really tired. One of them came up to the counter while the other one stood at one of the tables. "Our dining room is closed for the night, but I can still take a small order if you want it for takeout." The man at the counter just stared at the menu and didn't say anything. I stood there uncomfortably as the man shifted his gaze to behind me, as if he was inspecting the place. A few seconds later, the man by the table quickly walked out and the other guy followed. It was definitely the weirdest encounter I'd probably had, and I couldn't really think of any reasonable explanation. I kind of just assumed that they were planning on robbing me, but then decided otherwise for some reason. The next morning I told my dad about it, and he said I could start locking the doors at around 1:45 for the next few days. Another week went by with nothing unusual before it happened again. I had a customer picking up an order around 1:30, and almost as soon as he left, one of the men from last week walked in. It was the one that was standing at the table, and I noticed right away that he was wearing the same exact clothing as last time. However, this time he came up to the counter. He looked me in the eyes for a second, and then asked me if I could help him jump-start his car. The way he said it was really creepy, and it was very obvious that there was something else going on here. Sorry, I have to stay in the restaurant during my shift." His face immediately shifted into a frown. He said it would only take a minute, and no one would know that I left. At this point, I knew something was very off, and I started to panic a little bit in my head. He started making his way back to the door, gesturing me to follow him. I honestly wasn't sure what to do, and was really freaking out, but my fight response was starting, and my adrenaline was pumping. It's worth mentioning that I'm not really that big of a guy at all, and this man was much larger than me. Plus, I was pretty confident that the other guy was nearby too, probably ready to jump me if I didn't comply. But I figured I was screwed either way, so I might as well try to fight. I grabbed a pair of scissors we had behind the counter and stood my ground. The man turned around again once he reached the door, and this time he looked angry and demanded that I followed him. At that same instant, a loud bang came from behind me, followed by the back door slamming open. I ran to the back, and as soon as the guy saw me, he bolted right back outside. I turned around quickly and ran back to the front counter, but the other guy had left as well. I obviously called the police afterwards and gave them the security footage, but it was pretty low quality and hard to make out any identity from them. Anyways, I'm still not really sure why they didn't just attack me and rob the place, but my best guess is that they were just trying to rob the store without harming anyone, so as soon as they saw I was gonna fight, they ran. Those 2 could have easily taken me down and made the situation much worse, so I'm glad it didn't turn out that way. I work as a cybersecurity analyst for a large office company in my town. I had just started off my first job in the field, so of course I had to work the shift that nobody else wanted to. Working overnight wasn't as terrible as I thought, though. It was actually pretty peaceful. My job mainly consisted of looking through log files to make sure nothing sketchy happened while the rest of the crew was sleeping. This meant that I was always pretty much alone in the office building for several hours. I'd fall asleep pretty often, as staring at a screen for hours on end in the middle of the night was hard on my eyes, and with nobody there to keep me company, staying awake wasn't very easy. I started setting soft alarms on my phone to go off every hour, just to make sure that I didn't sleep through my entire shift. I had been working this job for about 4 months when this happened, and I actually still work there now. It was a regular night, and my coworker had just finished his shift at 12 o'clock and left the building. A couple minutes later, I got up and started the coffee machine, and then I walked down the main hallway to do a general check for anyone still in the building. This was my regular routine, just to make myself more comfortable. I sat back down at my desk and took my phone out to turn on the alarms, and then continued on with my work. It was about 20 minutes later when I realized I never heard the coffee machine beep that it was done, and I went to check on it. I walked down the hall to the small coffee desk and saw that there was no coffee in the pot, and then I saw that the entire coffee machine was turned off. I thought it was weird, but that's about it, and I just turned it back on and went back to my desk. As soon as I sat down, I noticed my phone wasn't where I had left it on the desk. I patted down my pockets and ran back to the coffee desk, but it wasn't there either. I played it back in my memory, and I knew for sure that I had placed it right on my desk right next to my keyboard. I started to get really freaked out and looked around frantically. The way my desk was set up, it was right in the middle of a large room with other desks and computers. I felt like I was being watched as I stood there in the middle, knowing that someone else had to be in there with me. Nervously, I called out in a shaky voice to my friend, really hoping that it was just him playing some dumb prank on me. I waited for a few seconds, but there was no reply. As I stood by my desk, another few seconds went by before I heard a soft shuffling coming from behind a desk in the far corner. Almost immediately after, my phone alarm rang from the opposite corner of the room. My first thought was that there were probably 2 unknown strangers in the room with me, and I instantly started running for the door out of the building. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me as I made it out, but I didn't take any chances. I ran across the street to a neighboring gas station, and I called 911 with their phone to report the unknown people in our office building. The police arrived quicker than I thought and searched the building. They brought out a man after only a few minutes, though I didn't recognize him at all. They also retrieved my phone, which they found behind some boxes in the corner of the office. He was also found with a small knife in his pocket. The next day, we got a lot more information about what really took place. Apparently, the man was an old employee who had been fired recently before I started working there. The man told the police he was trying to scare me in order to get me to leave the building so that he could take back his company laptop. Apparently he had information that he wanted from it. At least, those were his claims. It all seems really weird to me, and I'm not sure if I even trusted his reasonings to breaking in, but my coworkers did say that they remembered the guy, and he was definitely a little bit strange. I'm glad I got out of there when I did, though, because I'm not sure what would have happened if his plan didn't work and I chose to stay in the building. I lived in a small apartment for most of my 20s, as it was all that I could afford since I lived alone. My complex was small and only had 6 total apartments in it. Most of the people living there were older and retired, and kept to themselves. I actually liked the fact that I didn't have to interact with any of them every time that I needed to go in or out of the complex, as I'm usually in a rush or just not in the mood to socialize. Anyways, I lived on the top floor, and the room across from me had an old couple living there for almost 2 years before they moved out. I never talked to them, so I didn't really care, to be honest. But several months go by before someone new moves in, and another 2 weeks went by before I actually met them. I was getting ready for work one morning and preparing my packed lunch when I hear the neighbor's door open. I didn't think much of it until another minute went by, and I realized that I never heard the door close. I finished getting ready and put my shoes on, then opened my door to leave. I immediately noticed that the neighbor's door was still open, and a tall man in his 40s or 50s was standing right outside the door facing me. He smiled and introduced himself. I faked a short smile and told him my name, then said I had to go to work and began walking past him. But as I started down the stairs, he asked me to come in for a little bit and have breakfast with him. This was really weird, as I had just told him that I needed to go to work, but I just said sorry and continued down the stairs and out of the complex. While I was at work that day, I thought about how strange the interaction was. Thankfully, when I got back home, I was able to get into my apartment without any interactions. But the next morning, I woke up to a knock at the front door. I was really annoyed because I had work today and now I was up early, but I quickly got dressed and opened the front door. My neighbor was there, but strangely he was standing right in front of his open door again. He asked me to join him for breakfast again, to which I obviously declined and told him in a more aggressive manner to not knock on my door so early. The man didn't seem very happy about my answer and just kind of stood there. Then he said that I didn't have to leave for work for a while and I had enough time to eat with him. I knew that there was something wrong with this guy, as there was a lot about that response that was creepy. I firmly said no and then backed away and closed my door, making sure to lock it. Again, the more I thought about this guy, the more creepy and disturbing the interactions seemed. The rest of the day went by as usual though, and I got home around 6. I made some dinner and watched a movie, then got ready for bed around 11. I laid in bed for a while, thinking about my creepy neighbor and wondering what to do about it. I decided that if anything else happens, I'd contact the owner of the complex and have him talk to the guy. Then I leaned over and turned off my lamp and tried to fall asleep. But a few minutes later, I heard the neighbor's door creak open. I waited silently, listening to what the guy was doing, but I couldn't hear anything else. Again though, I never heard the door close. I was pretty nervous, unsure of what the man could possibly be doing this late at night. Eventually though, I drifted asleep due to not hearing any further noises for over an hour. I'm not sure how long I slept before a loud knock at the door woke me up. But these knocks didn't come from my front door. They were at my bedroom door. I shot up, completely terrified, and turned on the lights. The only thing I had to defend myself with was a small screwdriver on my nightstand. I grabbed it and stood next to my bed, shaking in fear, before picking up my phone and calling 911. When they arrived at the front door, I quickly got out of my room and opened it. I was surprised the door was even shut, but I told the officers everything and all about my suspicions of the neighbor. Unfortunately though, there was no real evidence of a break-in, and they couldn't do much at all. I knew what I heard was real though, and I did not feel safe in my apartment anymore. I called my sister later that day, and she agreed to let me stay at her place for a few days. Those days went by quicker than I hoped though, and I started driving back to my apartment on Saturday evening. I tried to stay calm, assuring myself that the guy had given up by now, and everything would be okay. I pulled into the parking lot and made my way into the building. The sun had just set, so the staircase was dim. I slowly made my way up, trying to stay quiet as to not let my neighbor know that I was coming up. Once I reached the top, I saw his door was closed and I got a big sense of relief as I quickly made my way through my door and locked it behind me. I dropped my bag in the hallway and turned on the lights as I turned the corner into my living room. I jumped back screaming as the man was sitting right on my couch staring at me with a wide, awful smile. I sprinted out of the entire complex and into my car, then called the police again and waited for them in a nearby parking lot. When they arrived about 10 minutes later, we drove up to the complex and they went into the apartment while I waited by my car. Surprisingly, they came out just a minute later with the man in handcuffs. They said he was still sitting on the couch and that they also found a small knife in his pocket. The most disturbing part of this whole situation, though, was that when he was questioned, he admitted to breaking in 3 separate times, and I only knew about the 2 incidents, which meant that at one point he was hiding in my apartment, probably watching me without me even knowing. I have a little Jack Russell dog named Maggie, and she has a lot of energy, so when we go for walks, it's not uncommon for them to spread to the 2-hour mark. This particular day, I got home from work around 5:30, and the sun doesn't usually set until 6:30 or 7. Almost immediately after walking through the door, I put her leash on and quickly changed, and then we headed out. The walk went as usual, as Maggie just took me in whichever direction she wanted to walk in. Things didn't start to take a turn until about an hour in, when the sun was almost fully down, and unfortunately for me, I had walked further than I'd realized. If you take your dog for long walks, you know how easy it is to zone out, especially if your dog rarely stops to sniff. We had walked in a direction I had taken normally, but the particular street I was on was unfamiliar, but I still knew the general direction home. I started to turn around, but Maggie was standing still, and then she began whimpering softly, and that's when I saw it. Through the soft light of the sunset, I could make out a huge coyote staring at us in the middle of the street. It was roughly the size of a golden retriever, with matted fur, and with its mouth partially opened, you could see its disgusting sharp yellow teeth. I knew exactly what it wanted. I picked Maggie up and started walking the opposite direction. I was a bit fearful, but for some reason I thought it would just go away. I didn't know these streets very well, but what I did know was that I had to keep moving. As I quickly continued, the coyote slowly followed, keeping its distance still. But the darker it got, the more scared I became, and after walking down random neighborhood roads in the darkness for a while, I came to the horrifying realization that I was lost. All the turns had messed with my sense of direction, and I had no idea which way to go. Through the darkness, I could now see the glowing eyes of the beast, and could now hear it yipping and howling. As I walked further through the dark neighborhood streets, every few minutes another set of glowing eyes would appear behind me, and even more, louder howls. I could tell they were getting closer too. I was absolutely terrified at this point, trying to hold back my tears as I was panicking and fearing for both mine and my dog's life. Every once in a while, I'd pass a streetlight and look behind me, revealing the entire pack walking slowly with their heads down, watching my every move. After almost 45 minutes of being followed, I began tiring, and I knew I was far from the safety of my home. Maggie began whimpering louder too, which made me even more emotional as I knew that she was aware of what may soon happen. The howling and yipping became more frequent, growing louder and closer. I looked back one more time to see all of their eyes staring at me from only 30 to 40 feet away. But suddenly and strangely, they all began to separate, moving to the sides of the road. A few moments later, a small car slowly makes its way between the crowd of coyotes and stops right next to me. A lady rolls down her window and asked me if I needed help. I was so thankful for her and told her to please take me home. There are almost no circumstances in which I would willingly get into a stranger's car, but I really had no other choice. The lady was really nice and seemed terrified for me. I was crying at this point, knowing I had just been moments away from a grueling attack. She kindly dropped me off at my house, which was almost 20 minutes from where she picked me up. I live in a nice neighborhood, one where you don't have to worry about your house being broken into or carjackings. The only growing problem in our neighborhood, and many neighboring ones as well, is coyotes. It's been a few years since this incident happened to me, and as time went on, there became more and more showing up around town, getting bigger and stronger. The public knows to be cautious, especially in parks where there are tons of trees and places for them to make home. Signs were put up letting people know of the popular areas where anywhere between 3 and 20 have been spotted. There have been news stories coming out, such as groups of coyotes leaping over fences and taking small dogs, and larger animals being found torn apart in kids' parks. Very sad stories, and some even a little scary. But you never think of coyotes as being an immediate danger until you're being followed in the middle of the night by a pack of the hungry and merciless. I used to work the register at a local gas station, though I've since left as there were a lot of strange things that happened when I would work overnight. But this one situation in particular will stick with me forever. I only worked the night shift a few days a week, usually Friday and Saturday. My shifts were usually boring and honestly just a game of trying to stay awake. The only thing I really had to do was stock the shelves and occasionally help a customer. I would get a lot of drunk people or families on road trips, and sometimes even whole groups of friends. But for the most part, it was pretty quiet. On this night, it was around 2 a.m., and I hadn't had a customer in over an hour, so I was starting to doze off a little bit. The desk was around the corner from the entrance, and there was a bell on the door that rang when somebody walked in, so usually falling asleep wasn't too big of a deal. I woke up after a few minutes, hearing the bell ring, and a few seconds later, saw a customer walk in. He looked like a typical 30-year-old man that would come in for some beer or a snack. He walked around for a little bit, down every aisle, looking at everything. Now, I've worked in retail for a long time, and I know what it looks like when someone is looking for something specific. But this man had nothing in mind. He was just looking at the shelves, browsing the store. During the day, this is pretty normal, but people don't usually come in at 2 a.m. to browse the gas station shelves. I looked out the window to my left to see if he was filling up his car and was maybe just passing the time, but there were no cars outside. A couple minutes went by before he eventually looked over at me and said thanks, and then walked out. I didn't know what to make of that, but I just figured he stole something small and was just being a dick about it. The whole situation left my mind after a few minutes, and I started to get really tired again. This time, I decided to grab my cart of items to stock and start filling up the shelves to pass the time. I'm not really sure how long I was stocking for, maybe 20 minutes, before I saw a man show up at the end of the aisle I was stocking. It made me jump a little, as I never heard the door ring. This guy was wearing a large hoodie and dark clothes. I pretty much knew right away that something was very off. The man continued down to the back of the store, and I immediately went back to behind the counter. I tried not to stare, but I noticed that as he walked down the aisles, he wasn't looking for anything. He was just browsing. It clicked in my head immediately that this was the same guy from just a little bit ago, but he had changed clothes for some reason. I also came to the realization that he probably came initially to scope out the place before doing whatever he planned on doing. I started to panic in my head. The man began to come down the aisle closest to the counter, and I could see something heavy in his front hoodie pocket. I made a split-second decision to try and prevent any further escalation, and I said, "Welcome back, sir. Need help finding anything?" He made eye contact with me, and I could tell he knew exactly what I was trying to do. He approached the counter, not saying a word, and brought his hand out of his pocket, revealing a small handgun. Then he grabbed a small pack of gum from beside the counter and placed it in front of me. He said, "Just this." Confused and in shock as to what was happening, I didn't even react for a few seconds before eventually scanning the gum nervously. Still holding the gun, he took out $1 from his jean pocket and threw it on the counter, then said thanks and walked out. I was in total shock, trying to wrap my head around what just happened. I ended up reporting the situation to the police and calling my manager, who didn't pick up. No updates ever came out of the situation, but it had me on edge for the last few months that I worked there. I'm still unsure of what really happened that night, or what the man's intentions were, but honestly, I'm glad I never found out. I work at a Montessori school, which is basically just a really small school with 3 to 4 very tiny classrooms for children. Where I work, the classrooms are on the lower level of a church, and my job is to clean them every night after the classes. It would only take me around 2 hours to clean all the rooms, but I work the closing shift at a nearby grocery store as well, so I wouldn't get to the school until around 10:30 most nights. Something you should also know is that the church shared a parking lot with an old people's home directly across from it. I will admit, a lot of weird and creepy things have happened at this school, but the weirdest had to be what happened just a couple weeks back. I had just finished cleaning the second room and was beginning to move all of my cleaning supplies to the third room. It was probably around 11:45 at this time, which meant that I was running a little bit behind, so I was trying to rush. As I crossed the hallway to the third room, I hear loud bells echoing throughout the church upstairs. Someone had rung the doorbell. Nobody has ever shown up during any of my shifts before, as it was always so late, and both the school and the church were closed hours before. I was a little nervous, so I slowly made my way up the stairs and towards the door. It was one of those wooden doors with big tinted glass windows on it. Trying not to be seen, I looked around the corner to see who was outside. I saw an old woman, probably in her 70s or 80s, just standing right outside the door. I backed away before she could notice me. I decided to ignore it and figured she had just wandered off and one of the attendants at the old people's home would pick her up. I started my cleaning again, mopping the floors of the room, but only a few minutes later, I heard banging echo through the halls. I jumped a little, then I stopped to listen. The banging stopped for a few seconds and was followed by the old lady yelling from outside. It was hard to make out what she was saying, so I made my way back upstairs, where I could hear clearly what she was calling out for. She was calling for someone named Abby. She was just repeating her name over and over. As I got closer to the door, the woman stopped. I looked around the corner and she wasn't outside the door anymore. It was a little bit unsettling, but I assured myself that someone probably came and got her after they heard her yelling. I turned around and began my way back, when out of the corner of my eye, I see the old lady staring at me through the window right beside the stairs. She looked me in the eyes and yelled, "Abby, help me." Her eyes were wide open and her hair was long and gray. I immediately ran back downstairs and locked myself in one of the classrooms. I took my phone out and called the old people home next door, and I told them the situation, asking if maybe she'd wandered away from them. The lady on the line told me that everyone was there, and they would have noticed if anyone had left, as they're required to check out. She said that she would double check with security and to stay on the line just in case. While I waited, I heard banging on the window upstairs, and a few seconds later, the woman on the phone describes the old lady's features and asks if that was her. I said yes and mentioned that she keeps yelling for someone named Abby. There was a small moment of silence. "Ma'am?" I spoke softly back into the phone. She replied, warning me not to approach her and to find somewhere safe to stay until they could have someone come out and get her. Obviously, this just made me even more terrified. I stayed in the room, still listening to the repeated banging on the window from upstairs. Now, this building was pretty old, and I wasn't sure how long those windows would hold if she kept banging on them. Eventually, I heard some male voices from outside, and after what sounded like a struggle, they left. I sat there for a few minutes, just thinking about what had happened. Then I got up and finished cleaning the rooms. The whole situation felt pretty unreal, and knowing that the old lady is in the building across from me still makes me nervous. I never found out who Abby was, or why the lady was trying to get into the church, but I'm just glad I never opened the door.